Holofera Bennett had never liked crowds. There was something suffocating about the way people dressed themselves in luxury, yet carried invisible loneliness in their eyes. As she stood before the towering mirrors of the Marquis Grand Hotel, adjusting the strap of her silver gown, she could feel her pulse quicken with every reflection she caught of herself. The fabric shimmered under the chandelier's light, hugging her modest frame in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost intimidating. This was not her world. Her world was a cluttered apartment filled with open books, half-finished work reports, and the gentle hum of her laptop fan at midnight. She was an analyst for a small firm, her life built on quiet routines, predictable days, and dreams she rarely spoke aloud. And yet here she was, about to step into a ballroom filled with the most powerful people in the city. Her best friend, Tessa, had insisted she come. "You need to breathe, Hollow. You've been living inside spreadsheets for too long. Come on, this is a charity gala, not a job interview," Tessa had said with her signature grin. Holofera had laughed, reluctantly agreeing, never expecting that this one impulsive decision would alter the course of her life. When she entered the grand ballroom, the sound of violins and the low murmur of conversation washed over her. The room was a masterpiece of wealth and taste. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, polished marble floors reflected the golden light, and waiters glided silently between clusters of guests holding champagne flutes. Every face seemed confident, perfectly polished, perfectly placed. Holofera moved quietly through the crowd, her steps small, her presence unnoticed. She was halfway through her first glass of sparkling water when she felt it, a stare, intense and unwavering. Her eyes lifted instinctively, scanning the crowd, and then she saw him. Across the ballroom, standing near the marble staircase, was a man who didn't quite belong to the noise of the evening. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit that fit him like it had been stitched by the gods themselves. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his sharp jawline illuminated by the golden glow around him. But it wasn't his looks that froze her in place, it was his gaze. He was watching her, not with idle curiosity, but with a deliberate focus, as though he had been waiting for her. Holofera's heart skipped, a rush of confusion and something else, a strange pull, deep and magnetic. She looked away quickly, pretending to study the floral arrangement on the nearby table, but curiosity betrayed her and her eyes flickered back. He was still looking. Trying to calm her nerves, she turned toward the terrace, seeking air. The night breeze brushed against her face as she stepped outside. The city stretched endlessly below, towers, lights, and life. For a few peaceful seconds, she breathed again. Then a voice, smooth and confident, broke the quiet. "You look like someone who wants to escape." She turned, startled. And there he was, the man from across the room. Closer now, more real than before. His presence carried a strange weight, like he filled the air around him effortlessly. "I didn't mean to intrude," he continued, stepping closer, his tone calm but layered with something unreadable. "You just have that look, the look of someone who doesn't belong here but is trying to figure out why she came anyway." Holofera felt her cheeks warm. "You're not wrong," she admitted softly. "My friend insisted I come. She thought I needed a change of scenery. Did it work?" he asked, one brow raised. She hesitated. "Not yet," he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that revealed confidence not born of arrogance but of control. "Then let's see if we can change that. I'm Damien Cross." The name sounded familiar, too familiar. Holofera's mind raced. Where had she heard it? And then she remembered. Cross Enterprises, one of the city's biggest investment firms, the one her own company had been pitching to for months. Damien Cross was the elusive CEO everyone spoke about but few had ever met. For a moment she considered retreating. But something in his demeanor disarmed her. He didn't seem like the ruthless businessman described in articles. There was warmth behind his eyes, the kind that didn't fit the image of a cold millionaire. "Holofera Bennett," she said, her voice steady. "Holofera," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the name. "Beautiful name, unique. You don't hear names like that in this city." She smiled faintly. "It's old-fashioned. My grandmother chose it. Then she had good taste." His gaze softened. "So tell me, Holofera Bennett, what do you do when you're not dazzling rooms full of strangers?" She laughed quietly. "I don't dazzle anyone, Mr. Cross. I'm an analyst at Renshaw Consulting." His expression shifted slightly. Amusement flickered across his face. "Renshaw? The firm that's been trying to secure a meeting with my office? Her heart sank. Oh no. Yes, that's the one. But he held up a hand, chuckling. Relax, I'm off duty tonight. No business talk. His eyes studied her with a mix of intrigue and something more personal. I'd rather talk about you. She didn't know how to respond. It wasn't often that someone, especially someone like him, took interest in her as a person. Yet she felt oddly comfortable. They talked for what felt like minutes but stretched into hours. About books, childhood, the meaning of success, and the strange loneliness that comes with ambition. Damien spoke like a man who had conquered the world yet remained unsatisfied. His words carried an undercurrent of melancholy that mirrored her own. As the night deepened, the lights of the city glimmered like scattered stars, and laughter from inside the ballroom faded to a distant hum. Damien turned to her, his gaze steady. You know, Holofera, sometimes life doesn't change in months or years. Sometimes it changes in one night, one decision. Her chest tightened at the gravity in his tone. And what decision is that? He smiled faintly. To stop running from what you feel. To let something or someone unexpected in. She looked away, her mind spinning. There was something dangerous in his words. Not the kind that brought harm, but the kind that awakened dormant parts of the soul. Before she could answer, Tessa appeared at the doorway, waving. Holo, we're leaving soon. Holofera nodded quickly. I should go, Damien said gently, stepping aside. But before you do, he reached into his pocket, producing a sleek black card. If you ever decide to take that chance, call this number. She hesitated, then took it. His fingers brushed hers briefly, a touch that lingered far longer than it should have. That night, as she lay in bed, she replayed every moment, his words, his voice, his eyes that seemed to see right through her walls. She told herself it meant nothing, that men like Damien Cross belonged to another world entirely, but deep inside something had shifted. The next morning, the city was drenched in sunlight. Holofera arrived at her office, ready to drown herself in work to forget the encounter. Her boss, Mr. Lewis, greeted her with uncharacteristic excitement. Good news. We finally got a meeting with Cross Enterprises. Their new expansion project, and guess who will be leading the presentation? Holofera blinked. Who? You, her heart stuttered. Me? Are you sure? You've got the best numbers and the cleanest proposals. Cross's office asked for someone detail-oriented. You're perfect for it. She stood frozen, her mind refusing to process what she just heard. Cross's office. Damien Cross. It couldn't be. And yet, when she entered the conference room later that week, clutching her presentation notes, the air changed. At the far end of the table, surrounded by executives, sat Damien. The same confident smile, the same piercing gaze. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then he rose slowly, extending his hand. Miss Bennett, he said, his tone calm but his eyes holding a spark only she could recognize. It's good to see you again. Holofera's fingers trembled as she shook his hand. Mr. Cross. The room was filled with people, but for that one fleeting moment, it felt as though they were the only two there. And in that moment, she realized the night that was supposed to be forgotten had only just begun to change everything. Holofera Bennett had always believed that life moved in predictable patterns. Numbers, logic, equations. She found comfort in formulas that yielded measurable outcomes, in the stability of data and decisions that didn't change overnight. But as she sat across the vast mahogany table in the glass-walled conference room of Cross Enterprises, staring at the man who had unsettled her very sense of control, she realized that life no longer followed predictable rules. The universe, it seemed, had a strange sense of irony. The man whose hand she had held under the city lights, whose eyes had pierced through her carefully built composure, was now the one she would report to, the one who would sign her professional future into existence. Damien Cross appeared completely at ease, commanding the room without effort. His tailored charcoal suit mirrored his calm authority, and the executives around the table hung on every word he spoke. Yet when his gaze met hers, there was the slightest pause, a flicker of recognition that neither of them could disguise. The air between them thickened, a silent current running beneath the surface of formal introductions and polite corporate smiles. Miss Bennett, he said evenly, though his tone carried something unspoken. I trust you've prepared the proposal for our collaboration. Holofera's voice wavered at first, but she steadied herself quickly. Yes, Mr. Cross, I have. She rose and began her presentation, her heart beating faster than her words. Slide after slide filled the digital screen with forecasts, strategies, and numbers, safe, logical things that couldn't betray emotion. Yet she could feel his attention on her, not as a superior assessing an employee, but as a man quietly studying someone he wanted to understand. Every time she glanced up, his eyes held hers a moment too long, and every time she looked away before the connection could burn too deep. When the meeting ended, Damien dismissed the room with a nod. The other executives filed out, leaving only the two of them and the echo of her pulse in her ears. "You've done impressive work," he said at last, rising from his chair. "It's rare to see such clarity in both numbers and narrative. You think like someone who understands more than spreadsheets." Holofera forced a smile. "Thank you, sir. Damien," he corrected softly. She hesitated, the word caught in her throat. "That wouldn't be appropriate. Mr. Cross." His lips curved slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Perhaps. But it feels stranger pretending we're strangers." The statement hung between them, delicate and dangerous. She gathered her files quickly, desperate to retreat before the air grew heavier. "If there's nothing else, sir, There is," he interrupted gently. "Join me for a walk? There's something I want to discuss about the project." She hesitated again. Every instinct told her to keep distance, to protect her job, her composure, her sanity. But curiosity, and something deeper, made her nod. The corridor outside was quiet, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the bustling city far below. They walked side by side, their reflections moving together in the glass, two silhouettes bound by something neither could name. "I didn't plan for this," Damien said after a long silence. "That night at the gala, I wasn't looking for anyone. I don't usually stay long at those events, but you looked like you were somewhere else entirely, like you were standing in a crowd but still alone. I recognize that feeling." Holofera's steps slowed. "You make it sound like you know me." "Maybe I don't," he admitted, his tone quieter now. "But I wanted to." She looked ahead, unwilling to meet his eyes. "That was one night, Mr. Cross. It doesn't mean anything now." "We have work to do." "Of course." He stopped walking, his gaze steady. "But tell me honestly, does it really mean nothing?" Her throat tightened. The truth was complicated. That night had stirred something in her, a reminder that she was still capable of feeling alive beyond deadlines and office lights, but admitting that would unravel everything she'd spent years holding together. "It's better if we keep things professional," she said finally, her voice low but firm. Damien nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Professional, then." Yet even as he said it, both knew it was a fragile promise. Over the next few weeks, work at Cross Enterprises consumed her days. The collaboration between their firms was massive, a multi-million-dollar deal that demanded endless hours, revisions, and strategy meetings. Holofera threw herself into the task, convincing herself that diligence could drown emotion. But every time Damien entered the room, every time his voice cut through the air with calm precision, her composure trembled at the edges. He never crossed boundaries, never said anything inappropriate. Yet his presence alone was enough to make her heart betray her discipline. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Holofera remained at her desk reviewing figures. The city outside glowed in shades of amber and silver, and fatigue tugged at her eyelids. She was startled when a soft knock broke the silence. Damien stood at the doorway, sleeves rolled up, the formality of his day's armor replaced with something more human. "You're still here," he said. She glanced at the clock. "Couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd finish the projections." He walked in, the sound of his footsteps blending with the hum of the air conditioning. "You work too hard, Holofera. It's part of the job." "No," he said gently. "It's part of hiding." Her head snapped up. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," he replied carefully, "you work as if the more hours you spend, the less you have to think about whatever you're afraid to feel." His words hit too close to home. She looked away, blinking against the sting behind her eyes. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Maybe," he said softly, "but I used to be you." For the first time, she saw the exhaustion behind his charm. "You think I don't know what it's like to chase perfection?" he continued. "To build walls so no one sees how tired you are of being strong?" Holofera's voice faltered.
Why are you telling me this?
Because you remind me of the person I was before I forgot what mattered. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Money and success, they fix everything on the outside but destroy you slowly inside. Until one day you realize you've become a stranger to yourself. I don't want that for you. The sincerity in his voice disarmed her more than any compliment could. For the first time, she saw beyond the millionaire headlines, beyond the commanding presence in a man haunted by something he couldn't undo. They stood in silence, the space between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the city lights flickered like constellations. "Damien," she said quietly, almost against her will. "Why do you still come to work if it makes you so unhappy?" He smiled faintly. "Because somewhere between ambition and regret, I still believe I can build something meaningful, with the right people." Her breath caught at the implication, but before she could respond, he added, "I should let you finish. Good night, Miss Bennett." When he left, the silence he left behind felt louder than before. That night, she couldn't sleep. His words echoed through her mind, peeling back layers she hadn't realized were there. For years, she had buried herself in work, convincing herself that solitude was safety. But Damien's presence was challenging that illusion. He wasn't just her boss, he was a mirror reflecting everything she'd refused to face. Days turned into weeks, and their interactions grew both more distant and more intimate in unspoken ways. They rarely spoke outside of meetings, yet each glance across the conference table carried a gravity neither could ignore. Her colleagues noticed the tension but couldn't name it. Some whispered rumors, others envied her position. Holofera learned to navigate the scrutiny with a calm mask, but inside she was torn between duty and desire. Then came the business trip. Cross Enterprises was hosting an international summit in Geneva, and Damien insisted she accompany him to present their final data to potential partners. She hesitated, knowing that proximity would only blur boundaries further, but professionalism left her no choice. The flight was long, filled with polite conversation and long stretches of silence. Damien worked through most of it, his focus sharp, but every now and then their eyes met, briefly, fleetingly, as if both were remembering a night when things were simpler. In Geneva, the days were a blur of meetings and formal dinners, yet it was the last evening after the final presentation that changed everything. The partners had left, the applause had faded, and the hotel balcony overlooked the dark ribbon of Lake Léman shimmering under the moon. Holofera stood alone, the cool wind brushing her face. "Can't sleep again?" Damien's voice came from behind her. She turned slightly, managing a small smile. "Just needed air." He joined her at the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You did well today. You always do." "Thank you." She hesitated before adding, "But I'm not sure if I belong in this world. Everyone here seems so certain of themselves, so perfectly composed." He chuckled quietly. "Trust me, Holofera, half of them are terrified of being exposed as frauds. Confidence is just practiced calm." She looked at him, surprised by the honesty. "And what about you? Are you terrified?" For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he said softly, "Every day." Something broke open inside her then. A realization that beneath all his success, Damien Cross was just another soul searching for peace. The air thickened between them, not with desire but with empathy. They stood together, silent witnesses to each other's vulnerability. Finally, he turned toward her. "Do you ever feel," he asked, "that maybe the people who work the hardest are the ones running from the deepest kind of pain?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "all the time." And for the first time, they didn't look away. In that shared stillness, there were no titles, no companies, no rules. Only two people who had built walls so high they'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. When Damien finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know where this goes, Holofera, but I do know that meeting you reminded me what it feels like to care again." Her breath trembled. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" "Whatever feels honest," he said. Then he stepped back, giving her space, proving that sincerity didn't need possession. That night, as she watched the lights of Geneva ripple across the lake, Holofera realized that some connections defy reason. They aren't about timing or logic. They're about recognition. Two souls remembering each other from a place deeper than memory. When they returned to the city, everything was the same. and yet nothing was. Meetings resumed, deadlines loomed, and the world kept spinning. But within her, a quiet storm had begun. She could no longer hide behind safety. She had met a man who lived between brilliance and brokenness, and somehow, his chaos had mirrored her calm. And though they hadn't spoken about it again, both knew something had begun that neither of them could stop, not without breaking something essential within themselves. The return from Geneva marked a quiet turning point that neither Holofera nor Damien dared to name aloud. Something had shifted between them, something invisible but undeniable. A thread woven through stolen glances and restrained words. Their lives resumed their old rhythm, yet everything now felt slightly altered, slightly charged. Every meeting carried the tension of what was unsaid. Every conversation tiptoed around the edge of something dangerous and beautiful. Holofera threw herself into her work with even greater intensity, convincing herself that productivity was the cure for confusion. She arrived early, left late, and kept her focus on the numbers, on the endless stream of reports and projections that left little room for emotion. But her heart betrayed her. It quickened at the sound of his voice in the hallway, at the subtle scent of his cologne lingering after meetings, at the memory of how his gaze had softened when he spoke to her under the Geneva stars. She had tried to bury those moments deep inside her, but they pulsed through her like an echo she could not silence. Damien, for his part, had changed too, though he hid it behind a facade of composure. His usual sharpness in meetings had softened, replaced by a quiet patience that others attributed to his good mood. Yet inside he was fighting an invisible war. For years he had built his empire with precision and discipline, but Holofera's presence had unsettled his foundations. She was not like the women who floated around his world, not dazzled by his wealth, not impressed by his title. She challenged him simply by existing, by reminding him of the man he used to be before ambition had turned him into a stranger. Weeks passed in this delicate balance, until one morning, the peace shattered. Holofera arrived at the office to find the company abuzz with whispers. Screens displayed news articles, employees huddled in corners, and tension laced the air. She approached her desk, confusion knotting her stomach, and opened her inbox. The subject line on the top email made her breath catch. Cross Enterprises under investigation, allegations of internal corruption. Her eyes widened. She clicked the article, scanning the words that blurred before her. Anonymous sources, financial discrepancies, insider dealings. Accusations aimed directly at the company's upper management. And at the center of it all, the name that struck her heart with both fear and disbelief. Damien Cross. Within minutes, the entire office was thrown into chaos. Reporters flooded the lobby, legal teams made urgent calls, and employees whispered theories no one dared voice aloud. Holofera's phone buzzed constantly, but she ignored it. She could only think of one thing: Damien. She found him hours later in his office, standing before the window, his reflection framed by the storm outside. The rain had begun to fall in heavy sheets, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray. He didn't turn when she entered. "I suppose you've seen it," he said quietly. "I have," she replied, closing the door behind her.
Is it true?
He let out a long breath, finally turning to face her. "Truth is a complicated word, Holofera. What they've written isn't the whole story." "Then tell me the whole story," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and faith. He walked to his desk, placing both hands on its edge. 2 years ago, one of our regional partners falsified accounts to secure a contract. We discovered it, cut ties immediately, and self-reported. But the media doesn't care about nuance. They see a headline and call it corruption. Her eyes searched his face, reading the exhaustion behind his calm.
Why didn't you say anything sooner?
"Because admitting it publicly before the audit concluded would have destroyed every honest employee here," he said, his tone heavy. "I've been fighting this quietly to protect the company." He paused, then added, "To protect people like you." The admission struck something deep within her. "You didn't have to protect me," she whispered. "Yes," he said softly, "I did." For a moment, silence filled the room, a silence that held both trust and uncertainty. Then, without warning, the door burst open. A woman stepped in, sharp-eyed, elegant, and radiating authority. Holofera recognized her instantly from business magazines. Evelyn Grant, the firm's lead attorney and Damien's longtime advisor. "Damien," Evelyn said briskly. "The board is meeting in an hour. We need to finalize your statement." Her gaze flicked briefly to Holofera, cool and assessing. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Bennett." Holofera straightened. "I was just leaving." But before she could step out, Damien spoke. "No, she stays." Evelyn's brows arched slightly, but she said nothing. The decision had been made. As they discussed legal details, Holofera listened quietly, her admiration for Damien growing with every word. Despite the accusations, he remained composed, focused not on saving himself but on protecting the company's integrity. When the meeting ended, Evelyn gathered her files, her expression unreadable. "You're putting too much trust in sentiment," she said to him quietly before leaving. After she was gone, Holofera turned to Damien. "What did she mean by that?" He smiled faintly. "Evelyn doesn't believe emotions have a place in leadership." "Maybe she's right," Holofera said softly. "Emotions make you vulnerable." He looked at her for a long moment. "Or they make you human." That night, Holofera couldn't stop thinking about him. His calm under pressure, his loyalty to his employees, his quiet strength. Everything she had once admired in theory, she now witnessed in reality. But admiration was dangerous. It blurred lines that were already fading. The following week was chaos. Investigations deepened, meetings turned tense, and the media painted Damien as both a villain and a mystery. Through it all, Holofera remained by his side, helping draft reports, coordinating teams, and managing damage control. They worked late nights again, side by side, exhaustion slowly weaving intimacy out of proximity. One evening, after another grueling day, Damien leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Do you ever wonder if all this is worth it?" he murmured. "What do you mean?" "The fight. The image. The endless chase for something that never feels enough." He glanced at her, eyes weary. "I used to think success would fill the emptiness. But the higher I climbed, the lonelier it got." She hesitated. "Then why keep climbing?" He smiled faintly. "Because stepping down feels like falling." His honesty broke her defenses. She moved closer, speaking softly. "Maybe the fall isn't failure. Maybe it's freedom." He studied her in silence, and for a moment she feared she'd said too much. But then he nodded, almost to himself. "You always see things differently." "Because I've lived differently," she said. "I've failed, I've started over, I've learned that control is an illusion. The only thing that ever truly matters is what you can stand for when everything else is gone." He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "And what do you stand for, Holofera?" She met his eyes, her heart racing. "Honesty. Even when it hurts." Their eyes locked, and the room seemed to hold its breath. But before either could speak again, his phone buzzed sharply, shattering the moment. He looked down, his expression tightening. "It's the board. They've called for an emergency vote tomorrow." "What kind of vote?" He sighed. "A vote to remove me as CEO." The words hit like thunder. "They can't do that. You've built this company." "Which means I also make a convenient scapegoat," he said quietly. She stepped forward, emotion rising in her chest. "Then fight it. Don't let them take everything from you." He smiled faintly. "You really believe in me, don't you?" "I do," she said simply. That night, after she left his office, Damien sat alone in the dark, her words echoing in his mind. "I believe in you." It had been years since anyone had said those words to him without expectation or agenda. And somewhere deep inside, something fragile began to heal. The next morning, the board meeting was brutal. Accusations flew, voices clashed, and the press waited eagerly outside the glass doors. Holofera watched through the observation room window, helpless as Damien stood alone before the table of executives. His defense was calm, factual, dignified, the truth laid bare without anger or pride. Yet she could see the strain behind his steady voice. When the meeting ended, the verdict came quickly. Damien Cross was to be suspended pending review. The company he had built from the ground up no longer trusted the man who had held it together. Holofera's heart broke at the sight of him walking out of that room, not defeated, but deeply wounded. The man who had once seemed untouchable now looked like someone stripped of everything but his dignity. She found him later on the rooftop terrace. The city sprawled beneath them like a painting of light and shadow. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned, his expression soft. "Don't be. Sometimes losing everything shows you what's real." Tears welled in her eyes. What happens now? He looked out over the skyline, the wind stirring his hair. Now, he said quietly, I start over. Holofera stood beside him, silent but steadfast. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let him face it alone. Because somewhere along the way, this had stopped being just about work or admiration. It had become about two people who had found pieces of themselves in each other's strength. And though the world was determined to break him, she was ready to be the one person who refused to let him fall. The days that followed Damien's suspension unfolded like a silent storm, spreading through the city's financial circles with merciless speed. Headlines screamed his name in black letters, reducing years of sacrifice to a single scandal, while board members distanced themselves to save their own reputations. Investors pulled out. Clients froze contracts, and employees who once boasted about working under the great Damien Cross now whispered behind closed doors. The empire he had built with sweat and sleepless nights was collapsing, not with explosions but with quiet betrayal. Yet through that chaos, one person refused to abandon him, Holofera Bennett. For Holofera, the fall of Damien Cross was more than just a business tragedy. It was the unraveling of a man she had come to understand in ways few others ever had. She watched him lose everything. His title, his office, his credibility, and yet he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had drawn her to him in the first place. There was something profoundly human in the way he faced ruin. No anger, no desperate pleas for pity, only an unspoken vow to rebuild from the ashes. She admired that resilience not because it was grand, but because it was real. When the company finally announced his official resignation, Holofera's heart sank. The corridors of Cross Enterprises felt hollow without him. His office stood empty, the glass walls reflecting only memories of determination and grace. Her colleagues spoke of moving on, of adapting, of finding new leadership, but to her those words sounded like betrayal disguised as progress. She tried to continue working, but each day grew heavier, until one afternoon she made a decision she had not planned. She walked out. She found Damien in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, sitting alone at a corner table. The man who had once commanded rooms filled with power brokers now sat quietly with a cup of black coffee, staring at nothing in particular. The light from the window fell across his face, highlighting the faint exhaustion under his eyes. When he saw her, surprise flickered briefly before it softened into something warmer. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, though his voice held no authority anymore. "Only concern." "Neither should you," she replied, sitting opposite him. "You built a world and now you're letting it slip away." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't let it slip. I chose to stop fighting people who were never fighting fair." "You could fight back," she said softly. "You could clear your name." He shook his head slowly. "The truth doesn't always win, Holofera. Sometimes it just waits impatiently and for people to remember it." For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the cafe faded around them, leaving only the quiet between two people who had already said everything without words. Then Holofera leaned forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Then let me help you build again. Start over from the ground up. You taught me that strength isn't about titles or money. Let's prove that together." He looked at her, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "You'd walk away from everything you've worked for me?" "I'm not walking away," she said gently. "I'm walking toward something that feels real." In that instant, something shifted between them. Not the reckless intensity of attraction, but the quiet birth of trust forged through struggle. For the first time in years, Damien smiled. Not the calculated, practiced smile of a businessman, but the genuine, almost shy smile of a man rediscovering hope. Over the next few months, they began to rebuild. Not an empire of skyscrapers, but a foundation of integrity and purpose. Damien poured his experience into a new vision. A smaller, ethical consultancy focused on mentoring young entrepreneurs and supporting local businesses. He used the lessons of his downfall as his blueprint, determined to build something that no scandal could destroy. Holofera became his partner in every sense that mattered, not through contracts or promises, but through belief and action. She handled logistics, organized community programs, reached out to small investors who still trusted Damien's character more than his reputation. Slowly, piece by piece, they began to rise again. Their office was nothing like the glass tower they once occupied. It was a renovated brick space in an old district, with mismatched furniture and sunlight streaming through high windows. Yet somehow it felt richer than any corporate suite. There was laughter here, purpose here, life here. They worked long hours, not out of obligation, but out of passion. And through it all, the bond between them deepened, quiet, steady, unspoken, but unmistakable. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Holofera stood by the window, watching the light fade. The office was empty except for her and Damien, who sat at his desk reviewing reports. The golden glow softened the lines of his face, and for a moment she saw not the fallen CEO, but the man behind the armor, tired, flawed, yet endlessly determined. "You know," she said softly, breaking the silence, "I used to think people like you were untouchable, perfect, powerful, far beyond ordinary struggles, but now I see, you're just human." He looked up, smiling faintly. "Just human. I think that's the kindest thing anyone's ever called me." She laughed quietly. "I mean it. You've shown me that falling isn't failure. It's proof that you were brave enough to stand in the first place." He studied her for a long moment before saying, "And you've shown me that faith isn't blind. It's seeing the worst in someone and still choosing to stay." Her breath caught at the weight of his words. Neither moved for a long while. Outside, the first stars appeared, faint and distant. It struck her then that survival wasn't always about grand victories. Sometimes it was about simply refusing to give up when everything told you to. As the weeks turned into months, their company grew slowly but steadily. Clients began returning, drawn by Damien's sincerity and Holofera's quiet brilliance. The media, ever hungry for redemption stories, began shifting its tone, from scandal to survival, from shame to second chances. Damien Cross was no longer the fallen millionaire. He was the man who rose from ruin to rebuild with integrity, and through every headline, Holofera stood beside him, never once seeking recognition, content to be the silent force behind the transformation. But growth brought new challenges. One afternoon, while finalizing a deal with a major investor, Holofera overheard something that froze her heart. The investor, a man named Patrick Hale, was speaking to Damien privately, unaware that she stood near the doorway. "You're doing well, Cross," Hale said, his tone slick. "But if you want this deal to go through, you'll need to play by the old rules again. A little flexibility in the ethics department. You know how the game works." Holofera saw Damien's jaw tighten. "No," he said firmly. "That's not who I am anymore." "Then you're going to lose this deal," Hale warned. "Then I lose it," Damien replied, his voice like steel. Hale left, slamming the door behind him. Holofera stepped into the room, her chest tight with pride and concern. "You just turned down $1 million contract," she said quietly. He nodded. "And bought back a piece of my soul." Her eyes stung with tears. "You've changed." "No," he said, looking at her gently. "You just helped me remember who I was before I lost my way." That night, as they closed the office together, Holofera realized something profound. Success built on compromise was emptiness, but success built on purpose was freedom. For the first time in her life, she felt part of something that mattered beyond numbers and achievements. Weeks later, a journalist visited to interview Damien about his journey. The article that followed changed everything. It didn't glamorize his fall or sensationalize his mistakes. Instead, it painted a portrait of redemption, of a man who chose truth over convenience and found meaning in humility. The public response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from young professionals, small business owners, even former rivals who admired his courage to rebuild without bitterness. As Damien read the article, he looked up at Holofera, emotion thick in his voice. "You know, I thought I'd lost everything that night the board voted me out. But now I see I was being given a chance to start over, with better people, better reasons." She smiled, her voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes the universe breaks us just to rebuild us stronger." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then maybe you were the reason I survived the breaking." The air between them shifted, not with the fire of new attraction, but with the warmth of something deeper. The understanding that love, in its truest form, isn't born in perfection, but in persistence. It was in every late night, every shared setback, every quiet victory they had built together. And as the night stretched on, Holofera realized that this fragile, imperfect partnership forged in hardship was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new one. The first chill of winter crept into the city, wrapping the streets in mist and quiet. It had been almost a year since Damien Cross lost everything, and yet, as he stood in front of the small brick office that now bore the modest brass sign, Cross and Bennett Consulting, he felt a peace he had never known in all his years of wealth and prestige. The glass towers he once ruled were gone, but the warmth of purpose had taken their place. People no longer bowed to his name out of fear or ambition. They came to him because they believed in what he represented now: honesty, resilience, and a second chance. Inside, Olafira sat at her desk surrounded by papers and coffee cups, her brow furrowed in concentration. The soft morning light poured through the window, gilding her hair in gold, and for a moment Damien simply watched her, quietly, as one might watch something sacred. She hadn't just helped him rebuild a business. She had helped him rebuild himself. Her steady faith had been his compass through every storm. He sometimes wondered if she even realized the magnitude of what she had done, how her presence had turned ruin into renewal. "Morning," he said finally, his voice gentle as he stepped inside. She looked up, smiling faintly. "Morning. You're early." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, leaning against the doorframe. "I was thinking about the past year. How strange it is, to lose everything and yet gain what matters most." Olafira's smile deepened, but her tone was quiet. "You rebuilt more than a company, Damien. You rebuilt yourself. That's rarer than any fortune." He studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You would have," she replied firmly. "You just needed someone to remind you that you still could." They shared a look that lingered longer than words could manage. Then she returned to her work and he moved to his desk, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. That day, they had an important presentation, their biggest since the rebirth of their firm. A group of international partners had expressed interest in funding their mentorship program, an initiative designed to help struggling small business owners find ethical, sustainable success. For Damien, it wasn't just a business opportunity. It was redemption turned into purpose. When the investors arrived, the energy in the room shifted. They were powerful, polished, and cautious, the kind of people who measured worth in results, not intentions. Damien began the presentation with calm confidence, but as he spoke, Olafira noticed something new in him, a quiet humility. Gone was the man who once spoke to impress. This man spoke to inspire. He told them about failure, about integrity, about what it means to start again when the world has turned its back on you. He didn't sell them a dream of profit. He offered them a vision of meaning. When he finished, silence filled the room, not the silence of doubt, but of reflection. Then one of the investors, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, said softly, "You've turned loss into legacy, Mr. Cross. I think we'd like to be part of that." The deal was sealed within hours. As the investors left, shaking hands and offering congratulations, Damien turned to Olafira, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "We did it," he whispered, almost disbelieving. "No," she said quietly, her eyes warm. "You did it. You proved that honesty still wins." He smiled, though his voice wavered with emotion. "Maybe, but it feels like we won something far greater than a deal." That evening, after everyone had gone, the city outside bathed in the golden glow of sunset. Olafira lingered in the office, tidying papers that didn't really need tidying. She could feel Damien's presence behind her even before he spoke. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "why life puts certain people in our path? Why one meeting, one glance can change everything?" She turned slowly, her heart stirring. "I used to think it was coincidence," she said. "But now I think it's timing, when two people are ready to help each other heal." Damien took a step closer, the fading light painting shadows across his face. "You've healed more of me than you'll ever know," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "And yet I still don't know what I've given you in return." She looked at him for a long moment, then answered simply, "You reminded me that kindness isn't weakness, and that believing in someone isn't foolish. You made me brave again." He stood there in silence, the truth of her words sinking deep. Then slowly, almost cautiously, he reached out his hand. "Olafira, I don't want to spend another day pretending what I feel doesn't exist. I know we started this journey in chaos, but everything I've built since, every step forward, has been because you were beside me. If you'll stay not just as my partner in work but in life, I'll spend the rest of my days earning the faith you've given me." Her breath caught. Tears shimmered in her eyes. For a moment the world seemed to still around them. No noise, no fear, only the sound of their hearts learning to trust again. She didn't answer with words. She took his hand, holding it tightly, and that was enough. The months that followed were quiet but profound. Their firm grew steadily, not through power or ambition but through reputation, through stories of lives they changed, small businesses they saved, and young dreamers they mentored. Together they built not an empire of wealth but a movement of compassion. And through it all, their partnership deepened into something unshakable, love that was patient, mature, and grounded in respect. Yet life, as always, tested them. One spring morning, Damien received a letter, an invitation from the board of his former company. After a year of investigation, Cross Enterprises had been cleared of all charges. The board wanted him back as CEO. He stared at the letter for a long time, the words blurring before his eyes. It was everything he had once wanted, power restored, reputation redeemed. And yet as he sat across from Holofera later that day, he felt a strange heaviness instead of triumph. "They want you back," she said softly, reading his expression. "That's what you fought for, isn't it?" "Once," he admitted. "But now I'm not sure. Going back would mean leaving what we've built. Leaving this. You don't owe anyone your past," she said gently. "You only owe yourself your peace." He looked at her, realization dawning slowly. "Peace," he repeated. "That's something I never had before you." The next day, Damien met with the board. The press waited outside, expecting a dramatic return. But when he stepped to the podium, he surprised everyone. "I thank you for the offer," he said calmly. "But my time here has ended. I've learned that leadership isn't about control. It's about service. And I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Gasps rippled through the room, but Damien felt only calm. For the first time, his decision wasn't guided by ego, but by clarity. He walked away from the podium with a quiet smile, stepping into the sunlight where Holofera waited at the edge of the crowd. When she saw him, she didn't ask what he'd chosen. She already knew. That evening, they stood together on the rooftop of their office, watching the city pulse with light. "You could have had everything again," she said softly. He shook his head. "I already do." For a while, neither spoke. The wind carried the hum of traffic below, the smell of rain in the distance. Then Holofera said, "Do you ever miss who you used to be?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes. But I think that man had to fall apart for this one to exist." She smiled. Then maybe that was the point all along. The city lights shimmered like 1,000 stars beneath them, and in that golden silence, everything that had once been broken finally felt whole. Months later, their story began to spread, not as a corporate headline, but as an inspiration. Universities invited Damien to speak about ethical leadership. Organizations quoted Holofera's strategies for rebuilding with purpose. They became symbols of what it meant to fail gracefully and rise with integrity. But for them, the recognition meant little compared to the quiet joy of ordinary days. Coffee shared at sunrise, laughter echoing through the office, the comfort of knowing that whatever storms life brought, they would face them together. One night, as they closed the office late, Holofera paused by the doorway. "Do you ever think about that first night, the gala?" she asked. Damien chuckled softly. "Every day. I went there looking for nothing and found everything that mattered." She laughed, shaking her head. "You were arrogant back then. And you were terrified," he teased gently. "Maybe we were both pretending not to be lost," she smiled. "And now?" "Now," he said, taking her hand as they stepped into the night. "We don't have to pretend anymore." The wind swept through the street, carrying the scent of new rain and blooming jasmine, and somewhere in that moment, Holofera realized how far they had come, from strangers in a ballroom to partners in a purpose-filled life. Their story was not about wealth or romance alone. It was about courage, forgiveness, and the kind of love that teaches two broken people to rebuild not just themselves, but the world around them. And as they walked together into the glow of the city lights, she understood what destiny truly meant. Not a path chosen by fate, but a journey chosen by the heart. It was the promise of tomorrow, and they were finally ready to live it.